Final cuts are here, and we're breaking down who I think is going to stick on the Falcons roster and also break down a couple of swing tackle options that they could scoop up off the waiver wire or make a trade for in the next day or so.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by the Gametime app. Just download Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, your very humble host. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Also known as Sirius Black and AKA Mr. Drew, right? My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you will call me Mr. Drew until you become my friend by becoming an everydayer and making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode is our final, air quotes, 53-man roster projection, because we're just basically, it's the final projection, but it's a projection of what the initial 53-man roster is going to look like heading into week one. And, you know, that's a little more than a week away. So we will do the best to break that down. But before we get into, you know, breaking down who I think is going to be on that 53-man roster, as well as the 16-man practice squad, let's talk about the Falcons offensive line concerns. We talked yesterday about Jalen Mayfield. We talked a lot about why, you know, while I wasn't willing to go as far as other people to, hey, praise the Falcons for, you know, just realizing that, hey, there's a leak in our pipes. Okay, congratulations. Now, can you fix the leak? And so today we'll talk about a couple of guys that can potentially fix that leak, specifically about the offensive tackle depth. And we'll talk about a couple of guys that have already been cut, a couple of guys that are expected to be cut, a couple of guys that may be trade candidates. Now, two players that we will not mention on today's episode that I've seen a lot of Falcon fans bandy about over the last several days, weeks, if not months, is Taylor Lewan and Ben Jones, just because I'm pretty sure Taylor Lewan's retired. And if Ben Jones isn't retired, he's been laying extremely low for the last 6 months. So I don't think either one of those guys are realistic options, nor really should they be. But, you know, today we're not going to necessarily do a comprehensive, but this is just basically, you know, in the hour or so before recording this episode, what research I can sort of quickly do to try to get this episode up in a timely fashion here on Monday night on YouTube or Tuesday, wherever you listen to the podcast. But not meant to be comprehensive. Right. I think a trade is also a possibility. We just saw one where Houston acquired Josh Jones from the Cardinals. They gave up a 5th round pick. That's about what the Falcons gave up for Ty Sambrailo back in 2017 when they made that trade for a swing tackle. So I don't know if you're going to have to give up more than like a conditional 7th round pick 3 years from now, in all likelihood, for someone that's a legit swing tackle option for you. So we'll see how that goes for the Falcons. But a couple of trade candidates that, you know, perusing some of the 53-man projections, some names that stood out to me, especially for teams that also run outside zone heavy schemes, come from Green Bay, Kansas City. From Green Bay, Yosh Nijman, Rob Demovsky, who covers the Packers for ESPN, mentioned Nijman as a potential trade candidate in his most recent 53-man roster projection over the weekend. And I think that's mostly due to Zach Tom beating him out for that starting right tackle spot, and Rasheed Walker, a player that they have as sort of their backup left tackle, seems like he's played well this summer and it's going to be a solid swing tackle. And I know Nijman was penciled in atop the Packers depth chart going into the summer as the potential starting at right tackle. So apparently he's fallen by the wayside. I know he's working under, I think, an RFA restricted tender, so like $4 million of non-guaranteed money. And so that comes off the books for the Packers potentially, and that's something that the Falcons would potentially acquire, and they have the cap space to acquire that with about $12 million in cap space. From the Chiefs, Prince Tega Winogo is interesting. Chiefs are also a heavy outside zone team. They seem to be more invested in their other backup tackles than Lucas Niang and Wanye Morris, who they took in the third round this past year. From what I understand, Winogo has played well this summer in the preseason, but because they seemingly have more invested in those other two guys, and Winogo was a guy that they sort of scooped up off the Eagles practice squad like 2 years ago, it seems like he could be an option to trade as well. But those are just sort of two examples. As incredible a podcast host as I am, I don't necessarily know all of the other 31 NFL team situation, but those are just two of outside zone heavy teams that presumably, have can afford to give up, a decent player, because unlike the Falcons, they have a deep tackle room comparatively. But, let's talk about some of the guys that are potentially going to get cut and the Falcons could potentially claim over the next couple of days. Akeem Adidiji's a name to put out there. He's projected to be cut by several people by the Bengals. What's notable about Adeniji was his offensive line coach when he was at Kansas is Mario Gebaril, who is formerly the Falcons' assistant offensive line coach, now the special projects of the defense coach, whatever that means. But there is some familiarity there. Adeniji's been a player that's really struggled in the NFL. He's played multiple spots, left tackle, right tackle, guard, over the years with the Cincinnati Bengals. He's kind of like the poster child for the Bengals' bad offensive line. But he's experienced, right? I don't know if he's better than Josh Miles, but he's played in big games like the playoff games, hasn't played well in those games. But is that more of a known commodity that would attract the Falcons? Maybe. I don't know. Dennis Kelly is a player that was just cut by the Eagles over the weekend. He was the swing tackle for the Titans when Arthur Smith was the OC there back in 2019 and 2020. Was most recently with the Colts. Did not play well last year, but really nobody outside of Braden Smith played well on the Colts offensive line last year, so I wouldn't put too much on that. The issue with Kelly is he's 33. Watching him this preseason with the Eagles, it looks like he's getting up there in age. He's kind of on his last legs, but maybe those last legs are still probably a little bit more reliable at this point, or at least a little bit more of a known commodity than what Josh Miles. He's basically kind of a Caleb McGarry type. Questionable pass protector, but a really physical run blocker type of player. Jermaine Ifedi, familiarity here in Atlanta. What's notable about Ifedi is because he got reps for the first time in his career at left tackle this summer with the Lions in that second preseason game, 27 snaps. Is that enough to resolve the issue, which is why Jermaine Ifedi was kind of passed over by Chuma Edoga last year for that swing tackle spot, as well as the Falcons moving on for him in favor of a player like Josh Miles this offseason because he was only a right side only blocker? Did 27 snaps in this week 2 of the preseason do enough for the Falcons to be like, you know what, Jermaine, we trust you a little bit more to be that swing tackle now than we did 6 months ago? Maybe. I'm skeptical of that, but we'll see. We've mentioned back in late May, the Dolphins in coaching connections, Cedric Aboyhe and Jerron Christian are the guys that are projected to be cut by the Dolphins there. When I watched that Atlanta-Miami preseason game a couple of weeks ago, one of them, I can't remember which one, was good in pass protection, but a questionable run blocker. And the other one was a good run blocker, but a questionable pass protector. But I can't remember which one was which. So if the Falcons do, I'll figure out which one that is if they do wind up picking up one of those guys. But we talked about in late May how Aboyhe, like Ifedi, was a teammate of Jake Matthews at Texas A&M. Christian was drafted by Washington several years ago when current Falcons assistant general manager Kyle Smith was running their drafts back then. So there's some familiarity there. Another player that's already been cut, who's not a tackle, but worth mentioning, Kobe Gossett by the Browns. I thought Gossett was serviceable at best at the left guard position. Of the many players that we had playing left guard, he was definitely the weakest link last year between Edoga and Wilkinson, and I feel like there's somebody else I'm missing that also played left guard for us. Oh, Hennessy and Gossett. But because he's more of a known commodity, is that something that the Falcons would prefer over in a relatively unknown commodity like Kyle Hitton? Maybe. Another player that I'm sure some of you guys are curious about is Chuma Edoga and what's his situation in Dallas. He did get hurt earlier this summer. From what I've read recently, he may be a potential candidate to go on IR, short-term IR, to start the season in Dallas, but it does not sound like Dallas is going to part ways with him. And I don't think the Falcons could, call up Dallas and say, hey, can you trade him back to us simply because he's hurt at this point in time and may not be ready to go early in the season. So we'll keep an eye on that. But those are just a couple of names I'll throw out there as potential options for the Falcons, that there's some familiarity with the staff, presumably where, someone on the staff can vouch for that player, and say like, I know what this guy is. Bring him into the building. He can give us what we can get. And I think that's probably what the Falcons maybe potentially looking for, rather than sort of taking a flyer on sort of an unknown option at this point in time. But we'll sort of see how that all plays out. But we will see how the rest of this roster looks by breaking down what I project to be the 53-man roster as we head into the regular season. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful, and Gametime is the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals and last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing and start getting hyped for all the fun you're going to have. I know for me personally, like I've been perusing Gametime, looking at, living in North Carolina, looking at some Duke home games, because I know Duke has a couple of potential 2024 draft picks like Riley Leonard and an offensive lineman, Graham Barton, I think it is. And, part of me is like, oh, I need to figure out which game I'm going to go to. But now I'm just kind of like, because of Gametime and their flash deals that are always up to the last minute, I don't really have to plan ahead. I can just decide on a whim this October, this November, hey, you know what? Let's just go to a Duke football game. And that's the beauty of Gametime. So whether you're a planner or you're just, calling it as you see it, Gametime is the perfect place for you to get tickets, whether it's football, whether it's basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, right up to the day of the event. And you always get the best price guaranteed. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110% the difference. So snag tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, there we go. All right, so we have graphics. And for those of you curious on who my 53-man roster, we'll start with the offensive players that I have making it on the squad. I have 2 quarterbacks on the roster, Desmond Ridder, Taylor Heineke. 4 running backs in Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Cordero Patterson, and Godwin Igwebuike. 5 receivers in Drake London, Mac Hollins, Cordero Hodge, Scotty Miller, and Josh Ali. 1 fullback in Keith Smith. 4 tight ends and Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Parker Hesse, and Michael Pruitt. 8 offensive linemen, Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dahlman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, Ryan Nuzzel, Kyle Hinton, and Josh Miles. Now, for my practice squad on offense, I do have Logan Woodside on the practice squad, the quarterback, 3 wide receivers in JJ Arcega-Whiteside, Penny Hart and Xavier Malone, 2 tight ends and John Fitzpatrick and Tucker Fisk on the practice squad, and 2 offensive linemen in Tyler Vrabel and Joe Von Gwyn. So if you checked out last week's episode with Kevin Knight, where we went back and forth, a couple of changes here or there, but nothing too major. Couple of changes on the practice squad, 1 or 2 tweaks on the roster. And when you look at that, I'm not going to necessarily explain everybody and how I picked on the roster. So if you're confused at why Taylor Heineke and Caleb McGarry and Scotty Miller wound up on my 53-man roster projection, by all means, leave a comment below. But, we'll talk about more of the back end sort of guys and why I chose some of these guys and left some of these guys off. Starting with the quarterback position, Logan Woodside, I think played well enough this summer to make the Falcons roster, but I just don't see the point of carrying 3 quarterbacks at this point in the season, right? Everybody talks about the new rule that allows you to carry 3 quarterbacks. And if you don't know what the new rule is, as I understand it, is basically if you carry 3 quarterbacks on your 53-man roster, that 3rd quarterback can essentially function as an extra 49th, basically, active player rather than the usual 48-man active players that you can have each and every game day. And so in the event that your 2 quarterbacks go down with an injury in game, then that 3rd quarterback can basically come into the game and play, right? And I don't think that's something that the Falcons or a lot of teams are going to be particularly worried about in September. Now, maybe if we get to January and your season's on the line and you want to be better safe than sorry, you'll elevate a player like Logan Woodside to your roster to make sure that you don't get in a situation like the 49ers got into, because that's really the only scenario where I think that makes sense, where you're going into a game and boom, you're down both of your starting quarterbacks. But I think Woodside played well. Even though he played well enough, I don't think anybody's going to claim him. I just think most teams are pretty content with their 3 quarterbacks at this point in time. And I don't see any teams like, oh, we got to get Logan Woodside to be our number 2. And nor do I think too many teams are going to be like, we definitely need Logan Woodside is going to be this massive upgrade over our current number 3 quarterback run our scout team. So I'm not too worried about Logan Woodside getting claimed, but we'll see if the Falcons agree with that assessment. At the running back position, because Arthur Smith has been kind of vague about what is Cordero Patterson's health status going into week 1, I don't think we're going to get any clarity until like next Wednesday when that initial injury report for the practice comes out. But maybe he's being vague because he doesn't also know. But I think because of that vagueness at this point in time, it makes the most sense to carry Godwin Igwebuike on the roster. And then if CP is, 100% ready to go and practicing fully, then maybe they can, waive Igwebuike and put him on the practice squad next week or something like that. But in the meantime, I think it makes sense. At the fullback position, as much as I'm ready to turn the page on the Keith Smith era and crown the Parker Hesse reign, first of his name, to begin at that fullback position. I don't see that happening at this point in time. And, I was rooting for Clint Rakovich, who the Falcons carried at fullback on their practice squad at the end of last season, to come in and sort of speed up that process. But I don't think Rakovich really played all that well this preseason. So I think the Falcons, if they're looking for a second fullback, it'll be Hesse, it'll be Jonnu Smith, and it'll be guys like Tucker Fisk on the practice squad. Speaking of the tight end position and John Fitzpatrick, I thought he did some nice things as a receiver. I thought his blocking was a little bit underwhelming. So I don't see him on the roster, right? I could see him with another year of seasoning on the practice squad. Maybe then he's ready to take over that Michael Pruitt role and be that sort of dual blocking, catching threat that Pruitt kind of is for the team, rather than the Parker Hesse. He's just more purely a blocker at this point in time. So I think we need to let John Fitzpatrick marinate for another year in the practice squad. Essentially, this year is kind of his rookie season because he missed all of last year with injuries. The wide receiver position, last week I had Penny Hart as the wide receiver 5. Now I have Josh Ali as the wide receiver 5. It's really a toss-up at this point. Like I'm going with Ali just because he seemed to play a lot more snaps, especially in the preseason finale against the Steelers. But literally, you could pick a name out of like no one really sort of came in and won this job. I know there's a lot of speculation that maybe the Falcons could sign a wide receiver. I think that's a possibility. Do I think it's going to be someone who's going to be a major contributor on offense? Not really. I think, Arthur Smith is like, 11 personnel, forget about that. We ain't about that life. And so therefore, upgrading the top 3 or 4 receivers is not really a priority. So if they do go out and get a wide receiver, I think it's more likely to be someone that can contribute on special teams, especially given the unknown status of Kadero Hodge. Is he going to be healthy for week 1? We don't really know that at this point in time. So that's something to keep an eye on. But I just don't think the Falcons really care about having depth at the wide receiver position. Offensive line, you'll note that I have placeholder next to Josh Miles' name, and that goes back to the previous conversation about the potential swing tackles. I think for now, the Falcons will probably carry 8 offensive linemen. Normally they carry 9. I think later in the season, they might carry 9 once they get, some of these guys like Hodge and Patterson and Mike Hughes and Jeff Okudah healthy, a couple of weeks into the season. You could see the Falcons keeping 9 to start the season and scooping up that 9th guy off the waiver wire. But for now, I think it's probably more likely that, Josh Miles is a placeholder for now, and they'll bring in somebody else to replace him as that 8th offensive lineman to be that swing tackle later this week. So we'll see who that is. If it's one of the players I mentioned earlier, is someone completely new, we'll obviously break that down if and when that happens. Other notes I think are worth mentioning here is something that Kevin Knight, who we had on the podcast last week, breaking down his 53-man roster alongside mine, mentioned sort of that Josh Harris quirk that we did 2 years ago, where the Falcons cut Josh Harris, to sort of, I think it was to create a roster spot for Kobe Gossett at that time without having to waive somebody else that they would have to expose to waivers, because Josh Harris has 4 or more years of accrued service in the NFL, meaning, 4 years of experience. And so therefore he's not, he can't go on waivers. And so basically the Falcons could cut him and say, Josh, we're going to bring you back. Just give us a couple of days. We got to do some housekeeping. We got to bring in, Kobe Gossett, whoever it was. And so I think that we kind of discussed a little bit who that maybe that player could be, and sort of doing some further research. Keith Smith and Michael Pruitt, to me, make the most sense just because they're established veterans. They've been in the league for 7+ years. So they won't be waivers players, and their salaries, I think, are low enough where you could cut them without adding on really much dead money onto their contract. So if the Falcons need to make a move like that, if you see Keith Smith or Michael Pruitt's name on the cuts, I think that's what it's about, as opposed to the Falcons are moving on from either one of those guys. So that may be something, I don't know if that will happen, but that's just something to keep in mind moving forward. So we will continue today's episode talking about the defense and special teams and who I have making the roster there. And we'll get that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So before we wrap up today's episode, I want to give another shout out to the everydayers who make this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. And for those of you that will be tuning in tomorrow for your first listen, of course, the plan is to break down all the cuts and if any other roster moves happen or any other big news happens involving the Falcons ahead of the 4 p.m. Eastern time cut deadline, we will break that down as well on tomorrow's first listen. But if you are curious on who I have making the 53-man roster on the defense, I do have 26 players on defense making it as opposed to the usual 25 that we typically have, just because I think, again, it has to deal with the cornerback position and the depth. We'll get to that later. But the defensive linemen, I have 6 defensive linemen in Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Calais Campbell, Taquan Graham, Zach Harrison, Timmy Horn making the roster. 4 edge rushers in Bud Dupree, Lorenzo Carter, Arnold McKevy, and D'Angelo Malone. 4 linebackers in Troy Anderson, Caden Ellis, Nate Landman, and Tate Davis. 7 corners in AJ Terrell, Jeff Okudah, D. Alford, Trey Flowers, Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, and Darren Hall. 5 safeties in Jesse Bates, Richie Grant, Jalen Hawkins, DeMarco Helms, Micah Abernathy, and of course 3 special teamers in Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough. And on the practice squad, I have 3 defensive linemen in Albert Huggins, Lakeo London, and Joe Gaziano, 1 edge rusher in Kamoko Toure, 2 off-ball linebackers in Andre Smith and Mike Jones Jr., and 1 corner in Natron Brooks, and 1 safety in Clifford Chapman. So, again, similarly to the offense, feel like I don't need to explain too many of these guys, at least the mainstream guys, but we'll talk about some of the back end guys that I have sticking. That last defensive line spot was a bit of a toss-up. I thought Timmy Horn played really well against Miami, but then I think against Cincinnati and Pittsburgh was pretty lackluster. And that wouldn't shock me if maybe a player like Albert Huggins has jumped him for that last spot, but I'm going with Horn just because, going back to something Kevin Knight said last week, which is having a little bit more of that wide body, and Horn has been playing a lot more one tech nose this summer versus Huggins, who's more that 3 tech sort of guy, and looking for that sort of Eddie Goldman space eater type to fill those massive shoes that Eddie Goldman left behind when he retired. Horn makes the most sense to me, but it could be somebody else. Joe Gaziano, I think, played really well against Pittsburgh, and frankly, I think is probably more ready to contribute on Sundays during the regular season than Zach Harrison is at that point. But because the Falcons have a vested interest in Zach Harrison, you know how that goes. I think Gaziano will wind up being on the practice squad, but he could wind up sticking on the roster because for that very reason. At edge rusher, initially I had Delonte Scott making it as the practice squad edge last week, but he just got cut. And as I said on yesterday's episode, I suspect that all those players, including Jalen Mayfield, Delonte Scott, Justin Ellis, and Bless Austin, those guys got cut because the Falcons aren't planning on bringing him back to the practice squad, but we'll see. So Kamoko Toure, it is good player, good pass rusher. So linebacker position, Tay Davis is at 4th linebacker due to that special teams ability. Didn't really see a whole lot this summer on the field, on defense, I should say, that makes me go like, oh yeah, Tay Davis. So linebacker is another position I've noticed a lot of people saying, okay, could the Falcons bring in more help? Sure. But again, I think it's going to be more of a special teams player. Maybe they could bring Nick Kwiatkowski back, who's expected to be cut by the Steelers, tomorrow. And he served as that depth piece, special teams value, also, has starts under his belt. So he's probably a little bit more of a reliable option for defense, and also, presumably would give you just as much value on special teams. So that may be something to keep an eye on. Cornerback, I think, is really where things get interesting with this group, because we're assuming Jeff Okudah is not going to play week 1. Again, Arthur Smith has been cagey about that. We don't really know about Mike Hughes. It seems 50-50 at this point in time, but based off of Arthur Smith's vague comments, it does seem like Mike Hughes, along with guys like Patterson, are trending in the right direction towards playing in week 1. The Falcons have historically had 5 active corners each and every week on their game day roster. And if Okudah's out, and if the possibility of Hughes being out, that's the reason to carry a 7th corner. Right. And I just picked Darren Hall just because of his experience, even though he didn't really do anything this summer. I think I mentioned that on the previous episode of the pod. I thought Natron Brooks did some good work, but just because Hall seems to have a little bit more experience and more reps on special teams, that to me kind of broke the tie between those guys. But I could definitely see the Falcons going with Brooks just because they're, done just like they are with Jalen Mayfield, done with the Darren Hall experience. So we'll see how that goes. If you're wondering why Breon Borders isn't on this, he is suspended for the first 2 games, so he wouldn't be on the practice squad or the roster for the initial 53, but that may be somebody that they potentially entertain bringing back in week 3 or later, either on the practice squad or on the roster if need be. So we'll see about that. 5 safeties sticking it. Once again, I just think, Hellam's played well enough. He's going to be on the roster. The question is Abernathy. And I think Abernathy's special teams value, because of the injuries to guys like Kadero Hodge and Mike Hughes and Cordero Patterson, all those guys that potentially would be playing on special teams week 1, I think it makes more sense to have Abernathy on the roster. And this goes back to kind of the Logan Woodside conversation where it's like, a third quarterback is a luxury, and given that Logan Woodside's not going to contribute on special teams like Abernathy is, it makes more sense to me, at least in week 1, to have Micah Abernathy on your roster versus Logan Woodside. Maybe later in the season when you're a little bit healthier, you're not worried about, bodies on special teams. Maybe that's a case for Logan Woodside to be on the roster, and maybe you put Abernathy on the practice squad at that point in time. But we'll just sort of have to see how that all plays out. And of course, I shouldn't have to explain the special teams. We got Liam, the Highlander, McCullough, locking down that long snapper role. And of course, Younghoe Koo, managed to beat out Matthew Trickett for that kicker spot. I know it was touch and go there for a while, guys, with Matthew Trickett, sneaking up on Younghoe Koo, but he wound up winning that spot. So that is it, guys, for my 53-man roster projection. Of course, always welcome your feedback, any questions you have, any hot takes, spicy takes you think. I don't think there's too many surprises expected. I don't know how you guys feel about this. I can't remember if it was Jarvis or somebody else asking about potential surprise cuts, and he was basically like, the one surprise cut was Michael Walker, and like that's already been taken care of, and so that's really it, right? I think maybe Eddie Goldman going into the camp was like another player that was on that sort of, I don't know if he's going to stick, and that already was taken care of. So I'm not expecting any surprise cuts. Again, going back to that, if we see like a Michael Pruitt or Keith Smith, that's probably, it's not the Falcons actually cutting that guy. It's just more of a clerical issue like it was with Josh Harris 2 years ago, and then I want to say it was Anthony Ferkser, that guy last year. That was more of a clerical issue where they put him on the practice squad initially and then brought him up to the roster, and then he was like on the roster for the rest of the season. So we'll see how it all plays out. Of course, we'll be breaking it down on your first listen tomorrow's episode, guys. Make sure you continually make this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day, of course, on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. For your second listen, of course, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta and Locked On NFL for their insights not only into all things Atlanta sports, including the Falcons cuts, as well as NFL, all things NFL for the other 31 NFL teams. A lot of moves being made, trades that will be happening. So if you want to stay up to date on that stuff, then by all means check out Locked On Sports Atlanta and Locked On NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.